Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the solo form of Taijiquan. There's way too much to talk about in terms of that to cover even a millionth of it in one short little thing. But I would like to specifically address the question of the short form, the long form, and other perhaps intermediate length forms that people have made up. I started teaching in the spring of 1968. That's over 50 years ago. And in that time, the question I've been asked perhaps more than any other by people who are looking for a teacher is either which form is better, the short form or the long form, or perhaps which form do you teach? And it's clear that this is an important question for them. And so I thought I'd address it today. And I must give you the short answer to all this is that what I really want to make you understand is that it's not a very important question. The length of the form, the organization of the movements and so forth is probably the least important thing about it. In fact, the form itself is not definitive of Taijiquan. Taijiquan is defined by something you do with another person. The form is not your goal. The form is not a performance. The form is not a ritual. The form is not intended to be proof of how well you do Taijiquan. Because as I said, how well you do Taijiquan really depends on how you do it with some other person. It's completely true that one could be a Taiji master and not do any of the forms extant today, or even do the form at all, as long as he actually was able to do the internal things. And I say internal, when I mean internal, I mean things that are behavioral habits which are so deep and internal that they're invisible, effectively. There's no way you can really be a recognizable master of Taijiquan any more than you can be a world-famous secret agent. And it's a contradiction in terms. And by definition, almost, what you do when you do Taijiquan is quite an invisible thing. So when you do the form is your opportunity to approach these invisible things. And to do it, you really need the ingredients of the form. Moving very slowly is one of them. Why do we move very slowly? There's a lot of reasons for that, which I've actually covered in other talks. But the point is, we do move slowly, and it is an important thing that we do. So I don't mean to denigrate the importance of the form at all, but just to understand that what is important about it has nothing to do with how long, how short it is, or the sequence of the movements. Now, I should say, certain sequences of movements are taken from extremely expectable, or I want to say traditional, but habitual things that happen in certain fights. One of my favorite examples is the transition from needle at the sea bottom to spread arms like a fan to Pichen and Shui. This is three separate movements, and they're strung together, and I would not break them apart because they really represent a very kind of classical sequence of things in martial arts. Taiji was created at a time in China when the relevant martial arts and what everybody practiced was something that looks a lot like Shaolin, in the sense of these kind of stances and movements and so forth. So you can think of it as a kind of reform of those movements, because that's what they started off with. But the movements have been changed, definitely, in certain external ways. But the external ways they've been changed are very subtle. So subtle, in fact, that someone who's learned them in a traditional sense might look at what you're doing and say, it's just wrong. You're just making a mistake. But the mistake, what they call a mistake, could be a very deliberate change. So this is what's important in the form. There's a whole lot of, in one work, I broke down the necessary ingredients to understanding Taijiquan to 8 ingredients. And the first 3 I mentioned in the book, the first 3 you can practice all by yourself in the form. The other 5 you can't practice without a partner. But those first 3 cover a lot of ground. Literally, I wrote a book called Meditations for the Solo Form, in which I tried to cover just a dozen or so of the things that you might be concentrating on when you do the form. There's a whole lot of things to do. As an example, we do in the form something called empty steps. What those are and how you do them, it's something you have to learn. There's something we call separating substantial and insubstantial. It just so happens that substantial and insubstantial are more and more difficult to separate the slower you go. So the study of separating them and the conscientious application of that thing is a very important thing in the form. Another thing you can practice in the form is Taijiquan. This is the so-called silk reeling movements, the winding changes of the body. And whenever literature in martial arts, or in Taiji in particular, talks about internal movement, they're talking about Taijiquan. They're not talking about some mysterious thing that happens inside your body. They're talking about something that's quite explainable and quite elaborate, in fact. So in my meditations book, I devote a whole chapter to Taijiquan, but easily a whole book could be devoted to it and still leave a lot of things out. So, in other words, there's a lot of stuff to work on. There are things like, first of all, just correct posture. Correct posture is constantly challenged by every move that you make. By that, I mean most of what amounts to correct posture is correct spinal posture, what we call plucking up the back and connecting the torso together with the hips so that it operates as one unit, kind of like an egg. This, every time we move, is challenged to a certain extent. Even raising the hands can challenge a lot of important points of form, like raising your shoulders up or breaking your back or doing some kind of thing like that. So the moves are valuable in the sense that the different moves might challenge these things in different ways. But the important thing is the thing that they're challenging is always the same. Jiang Ching made the remark that if you did grasp a sparrow's tail with even a shred of correctness, you would end up doing 90% of what you can get out of the form. And in fact, he even amplified on that once when he said, well, even the exercise, Qigong exercise called constant bear, if you even did constant bear correctly, you'd be doing at least 60 or 70% of the form. So in other words, and that's a relatively simple looking exercise. But these are rather deep internal things that won't really change the look of the exercise much and won't be recognizable except to real experts. So it's hard when you're watching someone do the form if you have no experience with it. It's extremely hard to tell whether what he's doing is really some kind of subtle change or whether he is just doing some kind of performance for you that's designed to impress you. You wouldn't be expected to be able to make a distinction like that. And in fact, since the form is a situation which you can work on internal things, you don't exactly get better at it. It is not to be perfected. It is not to be polished and made up into something very impressive to show your friends. Instead, it's something that you might look very confident, very smooth doing one day, and then after learning something that you needed to pay attention to, you might look very hesitant and even clumsy the next day because you're trying to put some sort of new consciousness into your body. This is a very important way to look at the form. Like I say, it doesn't improve. It's a mechanism by which you can improve your advanced studies. The advanced studies, one of their whole mechanisms in Taijiquan is, the advanced studies are, by advanced studies I mean Tuisho, three-step Tuisho, Dalu, Sanshou. These are the advanced studies of Taijiquan, and one of their greatest features is they're diagnostic. When you have trouble doing them, if you have a good teacher, he can tell you not only why you're having trouble, but what exercise to go back to that you should have used to perfect the particular habit or unconscious behavior that you needed to do this correctly. And in, I'd say 90% of the cases, it goes back to the form. In other words, it's something that you could have, it's a mistake you could have avoided if you had just been more conscientious in terms of something that you did in the form. But you don't really have the motivation to do that until you really see the result, until you're, in a sense, punished for not doing it. Then when you go back, it becomes a very special thing. In my own case, I had to get to a very advanced level before I recognized the extreme importance of keeping your feet completely flat on the floor. I don't want to go into the details of why this is so, but I just want to say that at a certain point, it made me really wish that when I was a beginner, I would have paid more attention to that particular direction. And I would have thought that it was really an important thing to do. But it's never too late. This was 20 or 30 years ago that I found this out, so I went back. So I've still had 20 or 30 years to work on it. But the important thing is to understand that you're constantly finding things like this. This is why it's a tradition in Taijiquan that people who are really good at it always refer to themselves as beginners. This is because you really feel like one. Every time you find out some new thing, you go back to the beginning, in a sense. The two most important venues for correcting your mistakes are the form and tuisho. Tuisho, these are both things that you do. Well, tuisho is something you do with another person, but without stepping. And the form is something you do all by yourself. These are both attempts to eliminate a whole bunch of possible variables, like, for instance, the variable of taking steps, or the variable of even having another person to worry about. That's so you can turn your attention very strongly to whatever you need to correct. And this is frequently something very internal and very invisible. I mean, who watching you do the form would know that you're putting your whole attention on keeping your feet flat on the floor? The next week, they might see you and you might be paying attention to your suspended head top. The next time, you might be paying attention to something else, some sort of chance to jing aspect. You might even be following the motions of one arm or one leg just to make sure it's doing all the right things through the form. This has a lot of functional use, but that is its function. So as you can see, even the outward appearance of the form is not that important. What's important is understanding what you're supposed to be doing while you are doing the form. And as you can see, the whole sequence and length, and whether it's a short form or the long form, and so, this is not really important. What is really important is having a teacher that can tell you what your attention should be and where you should concentrate your mind and what kind of behavioral things you should work on so that you can progress to the next stage. And it's progression through the stages of Taijiquan that, which may be seen as rather martial in the sense that they become more and more effective in terms of martial ability. But at the same time, this is exactly the way you satisfy the requirements of Qigong and the requirements of, the most stringent sort of idea of health when you're doing it. So don't ever think these things are incompatible. That is extremely important. So you're going to need to know a lot of things about the form that are external, what a punch is, what a kick is, and so forth. But much more important are the internal factors. And for that, short form or long form, neither one is the wrong form.